Gustav Jung puts it this way: when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside of you as fate. So that which you repress, that's what you divide, that which you try to cut off. Nature has a higher plan. Remember we talked about the tragedy that visits you? Yeah, that's the plan. The plan is that the unconscious is made of the same thing nature is. So fate will work against your inauthenticity. Thank God it does. I wish it didn't come in the form of pain and tragedy and sorrow. But it does. Therefore we have to then enter into a new relationship with those dark guardians. Or continue resisting it, which continues the repression, which continues the fate. An endless circle, you see, of problems. And it's really never more true than today, you see. Now we look at man and his world. How his mind does create his reality. Well, Plato said it. States are as men, they grow out of human characters. The great Thomas Paine. To understand the nature and quantity of government proper for man, it is necessary to attend to his character. He goes on to say, the more perfect civilization is, the less occasion it has for government. Because you're self-governed. What do you need leaders for? Benjamin Franklin said it in this way. He said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. All pointing to the fact that what's in your inner constitution, your inner republic, will manifest externally. Erich Fromm, whose book we looked at earlier, and I want you to note these scholars, note these authors, these sources that we're referring to. He says that in addition to sadism, the passion to destroy life and the attraction to all that is dead, which is called necrophilia, its true meaning of the word, seem to develop in the new urban civilization. Right? Mind affects the world, world affects mind. It becomes a feedback loop. What is above is below, is the old Hermetic adage. He says that death is no longer symbolically expressed by unpleasant-smelling feces or corpses. Its symbols are now clean, shining machines. But the reality behind this antiseptic facade becomes increasingly visible. Man, in the name of progress, is transforming the world into a stinking and poisonous place. He pollutes the air, the water, the soil, the animals, and himself. He is doing this to a degree that has made it doubtful whether the earth will still be livable within 100 years from now. As your psyche becomes more toxic, so does your outer world. It will become axiomatic to us. Freud understood this deeply. Again, the psychologists have to pick up the pieces of all of these souls. So for Freud, the historical process is essentially tragic. The more man creates cultures, the more does he frustrate his instinctual drives. The more unhappy and neurotic does he become. We talked about the trauma. In my work I've always suggested that out of that trauma was born the ego. What we know today to be waking ego consciousness is the product, a recent product, an infantile, childlike troubleshooting and problem-making, problem-creating circuitry within our consciousness. Of course, the ego is particularly oriented, like a lighthouse light, to the external world. It's not really oriented towards the inner world at all. And we have to thank the ego for also saving us. Probably we would have a complete psychosis given what happened in ancient times. William Barrett, in his book Irrational Man, which is a book on existential philosophy, he says, so long as we remain in the womb of this externalized and public existence, we are spared the terror and the dignity of becoming a self. So again, we've lost ourselves in the light. We're actually hiding, not in the darkness, but in the light. Hiding amongst all the other existentially vagrant souls, screaming about allness and oneness and all of this other talismanic terminology, because it's the last thing we have inside. Won't spend much time on it, but my work, my analysis of all of this, I also said it with the ego, or you can think of it as an aspect of the ego if you will, came this thing I refer to as the mysterium. That the ego is really a two-headed monster. And that this mysterium has worked in the dark. It's one of the reasons why there are the barriers. See, everybody talks about these various levels of consciousness, or the ego and the pre-conscious and the subconscious. They forget about the barriers in the middle. That must be made of something. Where did they come from? I'm interested in finding out where the glue and cement came to create the barriers. What's that made out of? I mean, it's like, you You take the meat away and you throw away the other part? Yeah, but wait a minute. Where did that sinew come from? Who made those walls and those fences? Some would say, as they do, it's the ego, another part of the ego, or it's the superego. Wow. I looked into it and I referred to this archetypal or ersatz, or pseudo-archetypal presence as the mysterium. But anyway, moving on, commenting more on the pseudo-self, or the ego, as we say, Jung says, inasmuch as the ego is only the centrum or center of my field of consciousness, it is not identical with the totality of my psyche, being merely a complex among other complexes. Since I discriminate between the ego and the self, since the ego is only the subject of my consciousness, while the self is the subject of my totality, hence it also includes the unconscious psyche. In this sense, the self would be an ideal factor which embraces and includes the ego. So he's just trying to define more clearly what the self is. The ego, right, is only an ego because it's the social persona that divides itself off from the rest of consciousness, the vast majority. The self is the totality, including the ego and the unconscious. And so one could argue, as I do, that when psychologists talk about madness, dementia, psychosis, schizophrenia being the result of the waves and the waters of the dark unconscious, the id coming in to upset, right, the normality of the ego, what happens if they're wrong? What happens if the content of the unconscious doesn't seek to overwhelm and destroy the ego, but to embrace it? But that embrace has been mistranslated. We each fear that embrace. You know why? Because the ego wants to do the embracing. To use religious terminology, maybe the reason why you can't embrace God or embrace the goddess is because you need to be able to be embraced by that force. And as you strive to gain it, have it, want it, that force is pushed away. It's a very yin thing, being loved by the force. You can love it, but it's when it loves you that's the main thing. And how do you become receptacle to that? How do you become feminine enough to receive that wisdom? Well, the ego is incapable of that. It's not programmed for it, so don't expect it to happen. There's only one thing the ego is programmed out of, and that's trauma. So it'll act like a traumatized creature. Now, there's the quote. Carl Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to stop from facing their souls, to stop from doing their shadow work. So when a psychologist tries to get in there, all sorts of resistances and defenses come out. He's talking about soul. Religious people talk about it. It's no different than the self. Self and soul are identical words. And here's the classic quote right here. Thomas Saz. People often say that this or that person has not found himself. But the self is not something one finds. It is something one creates. Once you understand that, you have basically unplugged all the lie mechanisms that exist around you. That is the first step on the road to true self-discovery, true enlightenment. I've often pointed out that the soul, the self, is the soul. It is also specifically identical with what the religious people, the Christians, speak of as the Holy Spirit. And I elaborated on this in the article, 2012, Shiva and the Age of Aquarius and all of that. That's gone into in great depth. Well, you don't want to do it, which most people don't want to do, any of that. They'd rather run around. Okay, well, Ayn Rand reminds you of the consequences for that. Man, as she says, is free to choose not to be conscious. But he's not free to escape the penalty of unconsciousness, destruction. What do we see in the world? That level of denial. The magician Aleister Crowley put it in probably the most succinct language that you could imagine. He said that anyone who is forced from his own course, either through not understanding himself or through external imposition, comes into conflict with the order of the universe and suffers accordingly. Now, this is a man who's been accused of everything you can imagine. Every epithet of horror has been applied to him. No less, he was called a black magician. He says in his own words, I have been accused of being a black magician. No more foolish statement, he says, has ever been made about me. I despise the thing to such an extent that I can hardly believe in the existence of people so debased and as idiotic as to practice it, meaning evil magic or black magic. But he's talking here about the useful or necessary suffering that is visited upon you because you are out of accord with the universe, her, it, nature, which is ultimately the self. Live external to it, expect pain. Live in discord to the world's laws, expect pain. But what kind of pain do you want? The pain of the ever-loving mother or the pain of the boss hogs? It's your choice.